Hello and welcome to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez welcoming you back to our ongoing discussion around the topic area of leadership. Thank you for joining me again, and always by way of introduction, I will provide some background to today's podcast guest. So today's guest is currently the Associate Professor and Director of Professional Studies at the University of Southern Queensland. He is also a current member since 2008 of the World Federation of Future Studies. He has worked on the Nominations Committee, Significant Works Committee, and the Research Advisory Committee of that federation. So can I welcome to the podcast Luc van der Laan. How are you, Luc?
Yeah, I'm great, mate. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
That's no worries, and do appreciate your time. So can I ask you what drew you to looking at leadership in general terms?
Yeah, sure. Look, I see myself as a pre-academic, and there's a good reason for that. Before I entered into an academic career, I actually was in professional practice, studied law and went into retail and then into education and then into a number of leadership positions in not-for-profits and foundations. What struck me in that time, being on the boards of directors and in those leadership positions, was an increasing frustration around the fiduciary responsibility of leaders. Look, leaders essentially have two responsibilities. The first is that they assure good governance and compliance. As a leader, that's absolutely expected of you to make sure that the operations of those organizations comply with regulation and exhibit good levels of governance. And that's all around the notion of legitimacy. They have to do that so that their stakeholders legitimize them and their organization. So if it's a consumer, good governance will lead to better consumption. If it's a recipient of a service, then good governance increases the trust of the user of those services and the legitimacy of the organization. So this idea of legitimacy is really important. And that's one of the roles of a leader. A second fiduciary responsibility of a leader is to provide direction. And this is both short and long-term direction. The organization and its stakeholders need to be absolutely clear that there is some form of direction. And it's up to those leaders to fulfill this responsibility. If you go and look at the terms of reference of boards of directors, the regulations associated with directors, and the literature associated with being a leader in those environments. And this extends to political leadership and to policy leadership as well. The idea that there is some sense of purpose and some sense of what the end game is, what they're aiming for. What I don't like using the word simply because it's been misused, and that is the sense of vision. And this is where the frustration arose in my experience. And this was at a number of very senior forums, both political and business. And I was incredibly frustrated because while leaders tend to be really good at compliance and governance, they seem to avoid or disguise their lack of direction. And I asked the question why. And that's essentially where my interest in leadership and specifically the areas that I research come from.
Thank you, Luc. And look, that segues very nicely into the first of the series of questions that I have for you. So going to question one, why do we need to identify key leadership capabilities? And look, I think you've given us a good context as to why you've gone into the leadership space. So this question's a bit more specific around those leader capabilities. So from your perspective, what are those, Luc?
Well, there is a underlying logic here. And the underlying logic is that leadership by definition suggests taking a lead role or having a position of influence where there is some sense of followership. Okay, so the idea that there are leaders and followers is deeply entrenched in leadership theory. And we don't mean that in a derogatory term. It's just leaders have that innate responsibility of leading. That then leads to the question of why. And the question of why is answered through the next step in the logic, which is for any progress to be made, leaders are the primary enablers to arrive at such change. So I say primary because it's a contested space. A lot of people will suggest, and it has been done in research, that to ascribe leadership as the sole enabler of progress would be a mistake. And to some extent, that's true. But I think in an organizational political policy environment, the idea that leaders enable is fundamentally true. So that takes us to the next step in the logic. If that is fundamentally true, that leaders enable change, what capabilities are necessary for us to have the best possible chance of good change or successful change or effective change, or I believe change that is in the interest of the broader public and to the stakeholders in particular. And I default to public here rather than shareholders per se, as an example. The logic therefore says if leaders are the enablers, then what are the key characteristics that are likely to lead to successful leadership? And this area is, over the years, since the big man theory, or the first theories of leadership, this has been the key consideration, is what are those traits? And we went from being born with those traits to the contexts where those traits are most important and through to developing those traits. But at the end of the day, this notion of traits has been broadened into the idea of capabilities that are defined by the requirements of the task, but beyond that as well, to that which is unexpected, and that the values and abilities of the leader are able to take cognizance of and effectively deal with. So this idea of key leadership capabilities is something that's interested people since the beginning of time in trying to identify and moving all the way back in the logic, because they enable change and progress. So that would be the reason why I think it's important to identify key leadership capabilities.
Thank you for sharing that, Luke, and that we can unpack that for hours, but we don't have that time in this podcast. So I'll get to the next more specific question. So what's your views on the following? What leader capabilities do fit for future leaders need to engage with in the modern workplace? Now, you can get as macro with this as you like, or you can get as specific as you like. And for those listening to the podcast, you may shoot me for having asked this question of Luke, but I haven't defined what a fit for future leader is. And maybe Luke might give that a crack, given his experiences here. But I think it's worth asking the question, because this question could be asked in any industry context. And as a early career researcher myself, this is an important, I think, question to ask if you want to unpack the importance of leadership in any industry context. So over to you, Luke.
Yeah, sure. It's a good question, and I think it's actually far more complex than we originally think. I think there are at least two key considerations around this question. The first is, what is the nature of our age? Is it linear and a linear extension of the previous few hundred years, or is it a linear extension of the industrial era, or have things dramatically changed in the last 2 decades? And I think that we would all agree that the last 2 decades are characterized by dramatic change, and change across all dimensions, environmental, technological, what we consider as work, globalization of economies and industries. The list goes on to illustrate change that is non-linear. Certain key concepts have emerged, such as disruption. And we haven't spoken about industries being disrupted to the extent that they have in the last 10 years ever before. So this idea of dramatic change is the one question we have to ask, is what is our era? What typifies our era? And in the words of Gary Hamel, which I'd encourage all your listeners to go and read, is, change is seditious. The times are typified by great unprecedented opportunities, but also great threats. And so the idea of not just leaders, but everyone thinking more acutely about where we're going has become really important. The second thing that I'd like to suggest is that what distinguishes us as humans, as a species, is our ability, and this has been scientifically established now, is our ability to contemplate the future. And that shouldn't be something that's at a distance to any individual. It's something that we should actually intuitively, very quickly understand, that physiologically our brain is wired to link episodic memory with contemplating how the future may evolve. And I say may evolve, we intuitively, every single human in the world has a process of reaching into our episodic memory in order to establish a range of possibilities of how the future can evolve. And then the brain is hardwired to move to a decision-making process, which then makes a decision in order to achieve at least one of those possibilities. And that is just how we function. What I've noticed in my research, and this then raises the second question of which capabilities are the most important, is that as leaders, I'm seeing leaders move away from that innate ability to anticipate the future, consider alternative possibilities, and then move into a decision-making process in order to achieve the best possible outcome in their minds.
Can I ask you, Luke, just so that I don't forget this, you said in your experience, you're seeing that leaders are moving away from applying that innate capability. Can I ask why?
Good question, Eric. So in summary, if we want to consider which capabilities are the most important, I'd say this notion of the era that we are in and our innate abilities, the way we are physiologically hardwired, would point us in the right direction. And then coming to your question, why have we seen this retreat from those innate abilities? My answer to that is we're also hardwired to respond to fear. And fear can manifest itself in so many different ways, especially if you're a leader. So I'll use some examples. Politicians at the moment fear transparency. Their activities are far more transparent now than they have ever been in the history of humankind. So innately, what you're seeing are politicians that are becoming incredibly guarded, incredibly reserved, incredibly reactive. And the reason for that is because they fear the consequences of being so transparent and the effect that will have on their political power. If we move to the policy domain, because we're in such an incredibly volatile age, policymakers that have the responsibility for shaping public policy are fearful that their policies will be undermined in a very short period of time. And they would be left not only with the consequences of a poor policy, but professionally they would be left embarrassed. In a business environment, business people, other than entrepreneurs, it's the only exception that I can bring to this whole group. In the business environment, typically your executive leaders and directors of boards are incredibly fearful of making mistakes. Why? Well, because they're being closely watched and because so much can go wrong so quickly. in the business space, I've observed and have empirical evidence to show that they're relying on the analytics, i.e. the trends that are manifest in past facts. So any data that's historical, that can be shaped into some form of input to a decision, is what's being relied on. And if that fails, what I'm also seeing are that leaders then abrogate their responsibilities by farming the work out to consultants. So you're seeing this withdrawal from actively engaging, actively interrogating direction and the future in favor of being aware that there's dramatic change and they could so easily be wrong. They've become less confident in themselves, I've seen. So I guess that's my answer to what you're saying, is we're seeing this vacuum. I had a conversation this morning with Rebecca Costa, and Rebecca from the United States. She's written a book, and I only became aware of that book this morning, and I think I've lost it. But anyway, have a look for Rebecca Costa. The one book is On the Verge, but the book I'm talking about escapes my mind right now. She talks about this vacuum in leadership, and it's precisely what I've measured, is that while there is the ability to process big data, historical fact, there is a withdrawal or a vacuum that's becoming more and more apparent in leadership, and that's causing an incredible amount of vulnerability. So if you look at the world generally, and you look at your general average Joe, and you ask them, how vulnerable do you feel now as compared to before? Your average employee, your average government official, your average member of the community will, on an average, suggest that they're feeling more vulnerable. And the reason for that is because there is this increasing leadership vacuum. Rebecca Costa says that we're seeing the beginning of a systemic collapse. And the manifestation of that is in every little weak signal that we can see around us. We see it in our own politics. We see it in the international politics. We see it where the votes are going. We see it in business behavior. You know, just after the global financial crisis, Australian companies were investing way more than in fixed term deposits than they were investing in research and development. So, you know, there's this fear that's driving a lot of business decisions, and they're all on the conservative side, mostly on the conservative side. Now, remember, I did mention the one exception, and that is your entrepreneur. And the reason why the entrepreneur, there is no vacuum in the entrepreneurial space, is because an entrepreneur believes in a future vision. If they didn't believe in it, they wouldn't be pushing their new business. So that's the only exception, is there is an absolute belief and a mind map of how to achieve that vision already established in the mind of an entrepreneur.
Just one more thing to unpack, Luke, because again, we could talk about this for extended periods of time, but when you say the field is being vacated and it's maybe not primarily driven by fear, but something else, do you think, and I'll put this to you in the form of a statement and see what you think of it, do you think there's less of an appetite for risk amongst leaders now than there used to be? Putting aside those in that entrepreneurial space, that risk appetite is gone south as well. It's just not, people don't want to take a risk for fear of the outcome.
Absolutely. Now, let me just add that it's not just fear. It's also a reduction in trust. Leaders are experiencing unprecedented reductions in trust because of that transparency primarily. And we all know that a reduction in trust leads to greater vulnerability and lower sense of confidence. And I'll use an example of what evidence we have of how this has all occurred. Prior to the global financial crisis, on an average, Australian ASX companies employed 5 front-facing staff and 2 back-office staff on an average. So 5 to 2. After the financial crisis, that inverted to 2 front or outward-facing and 5 back office, mostly associated with compliance. Now, what that shows us from a systems point of view is that those systems are closing. So we're going from open systems, outward facing, to closed systems that are inward facing. And the reason for that is fear and what is perceived by the market as a lack of trust. Look, the global financial crisis was ultimately an indication of declining trust. So this has all led to a significant shift in how leaders observe their mandates. And your question is, has the risk or the appetite for risk reduced? Absolutely. We have various sources of evidence of that. One being the dramatic escalation of enterprise risk management frameworks. If you go to any large corporation, you'll see that the audit and risk functions are heavily invested in and to the cost of innovation. We have research that shows organizations that are audit and risk heavy have lower incidence of successful innovation. And it makes sense because to innovate, you need to take risks. So yes, that reduction in risk appetite, again, I use the point that there is an exception to this. There are organizational or corporate exceptions, and they're usually due to very different leadership or entrepreneurs. Look, let's not forget, and this was reported in the New York Times in 2017, just after scientists had discovered the link between thinking about the future and the area of the brain associated with episodic memory. And the New York Times at that point said, let's not forget that as humankind, singular foresight has created civilization and sustains society. It's a source of lifting our spirits, but it's also a source of most depression and anxiety. Now, I'm suggesting that due to the rapid technological change, we physiologically haven't been able to keep up. Leaders sense this. They sense that the change is outstripping their ability to keep up. And what it's leading to is, in very common terms, I regard symptomatic of depression and anxiety, fear, and a lack of trust. And when you get that, you get a withdrawal. And it might not be a physical withdrawal, but my research seems to suggest that there is an intellectual withdrawal that's taking place in leadership positions.
Taken together, that spells potential issues for things like innovation, because I guess it's one thing to say you want leaders to be able to grapple with the future, but there has to be reasons for wanting to do that. And one of those is to look at what you do and see if you can do it better, or see if you can take an idea and advance it to a next stage. Luke, I'm going to meld part of the second question with my third question, if that's okay. So for the benefit of the listeners to the podcast, Luke's pioneered an instrument called the TLB Strategic Thinking and Foresight Measure. I'll use the word basic terms here. The measure looks at three key areas: strategic thinking, foresight, and decision making. Now, Luke, if you can you give us just a very brief overview of the development of the measure and what you've learnt from applying that measure in real work settings, if you can?
Yeah, I'll try and be as brief as I can. Going back to this brain science that I referred to, if you look at the strategy processes of a corporation, a business, and even a policy-making environment, it logically follows three steps. Now, unfortunately, the advisory services that we've been exposed to over the last 30, 40 years have gotten this somewhat mixed up. And my research has enabled me to tease out essentially three steps in the decision-making process. And these are actually reflective of how we think. First, we consider the past and we formulate possibilities of how the future can evolve. That's been captured by the concept of foresight. Essentially, foresight is all about looking at the past looking at the current conditions or the current environment, and then speculating ways, and I say it in plural, ways in which the future can evolve. And that's why you see the term futures used a lot. I would argue that they don't really understand. Most people really don't understand what that means. It means that we develop a range of possibilities. Now, once we know that, and remember, this can happen subconsciously or does happen subconsciously in every single human being. It also happens subconsciously in many organizational systems, that before they even get to strategy, they've already thought about what could happen to the organization. Once we have a sense of what could happen and multiple possibilities, we then move into what is best for our organization. That question drives the next phase, and that is being captured by the concept of strategic thinking. Now that we know what's possible, let's integrate other variables such as available resources, the climate of our staff engagement, a whole range of variables, the capabilities of our organization, the market, the regulatory environment, the technological environment. These all come into the equation at that point, together with the possible futures. So the possible futures is only one input into then a range of strategic considerations. And once those considerations have been distilled, we're able to go ahead with the third part, and that is to make the decisions, to have some shared vision. And it depends on who you're talking about when it's shared. It could be whole of organization, it could be executive, it could be board, it could be dominant coalition. But some shared sense of vision then triggers the decision making. So we've got these three very distinct areas. Now, what has happened in the advisory space, mostly in the multi-billion-dollar strategy consulting space, is that this has all been confused into a weekend breakaway. And it's completely undermined the process, but it's also led to a 73% failure rate of strategy. So my argument and the research that I've done suggests that we need to tease them all out again. We need to ensure that each part of that process, first foresight, then strategic thinking, then strategic decision-making or decision-making in general, need to operate in very distinct separate processes, all highly related to each other, but not confused with each other. Because what we've seen in the last 20, 30 years of strategic decision-making is that the front end has been left out. So very little foresight takes place, and strategic thinking is limited to a weekend breakaway.
Should then leaders in, let's say, any given industry, and I won't necessarily pick the seafood industry, but it could be any industry, do we need to go back in some senses to first principles to ask the question in terms of developing better decision-making and better leadership outcomes in organizations?
Well, we've come full circle in this conversation. We started the conversation by asking whether the capabilities of leaders are really important, and being able to identify those capabilities is critical. And I think we've just arrived at that question again. Yes, my advice, I've talked to a lot of companies and leaders over the last 15 years. And the overwhelming sense that I've received from that evidence is leaders are saying, how do I do this? They won't publicly admit it. They can't publicly admit it. But when you having the conversation with them, they'll say, Luke, I know I've got to do it, but I just don't know how. And what that says to me is, well, if I was in that position, what would I do? And this is what they all do, is I would farm the work out, the how, and I'd get somebody with a big name to do it for me. And that means that I'll adopt it. I might tailor it a little, adopt it. But if it fails, it's not my baby. The big guy, I paid big money for it, and the big guys are the ones that did it. And there's this incredible shift towards that kind of thinking. The other form of thinking that I've seen emerge, and this is all symptomatic, is zero-based strategy, i.e., we are going to grow by 8% this year, and then incentivize every level of management to achieve those targets and achieve them. And if we see sort of mid-year or three quarters of the year in, if we see we're not going to make those targets, what we then do is rationalize our costs. Now, this creates a cycle, because this is inevitably what's happening in most organizations, is the cycle between driving for certain percentages of growth and then making the profit margins through rationalizing costs. But what we don't realize is that what we're slowly doing is eroding the capabilities of the organization through the rationalization process. And the one thing that I can say is that for every capability that you save $1 on, will cost you $5 to get back. And so there is this real cost to rationalizing, especially staff, because when we get rid of staff, good quality talent, we are essentially eroding our capability base. So what have I learned from my research primarily? We have two strands of cognition that feed into our decisions. The one is rational and analytical. The other is conceptual, generative, and creative. And what I've seen in my research is a heavy reliance on the rational and the analytical. Bearing in mind, there is no such thing as a future fact. So everything is based on the past. However, I've seen a negative 25% correlation against the conceptual, generative, creative thinking that's needed to progress organizations, to innovate, to produce outcomes that are in the overall benefit of humanity. Negative 25% of ideas. Again, I use the example of the exception. The entrepreneurs, the scientists, they wouldn't display these patterns, but certainly the leaders, political, not-for-profit, and private, are all alike. And I've got the research across the globe, from Canada all the way through Asia, Australia, into Africa, that can show these patterns across all these different categories.
Do you think industries are picking up on this gap or these issues around not applying all of those three elements that we talked about before, foresight, strategic thinking, and how that feeds into your decision-making process, be that decisions or strategic decisions, that gap's been identified yet, or is it still out for discussion almost?
No, absolutely. I think, if anything, the majority of leaders are aware of this problem. They're aware of it. The issue becomes, how do we deal with it without becoming personally vulnerable? I think that's the real tension. I think the other thing that I'd like to leave you with, and the agricultural sector throughout the history of humanity has been known for its innovation. I mean, it's one of the industries that we can trace right back into ancient civilizations, where innovation was the hallmark of that activity. And what I sense is that we've moved in agriculture from that culture of innovation and inherent risk to a culture of managerialism and control. And the one thing we can't control, and the recent times in Australia is testimony to this, the one thing we can't control are the conditions within agriculture takes place, i.e. the environment. And so it seems contradictory in terms to me that we are looking at a agricultural sector in general. Look, there are obvious exceptions. I'm not making a judgment call on the whole industry. But in general, what we're seeing is an industry that is becoming increasingly regulated, i.e. control, and increasingly managerial, i.e. Production focused, value chains focused, command and control, budgeting. Now, we need to separate management, good management, out from good leadership. It's a drum that's been beaten for the last 20 years in the literature, but I sense people still confusing the two. And I think in the agricultural sector in Australia, we've lost sight of the importance of thought leadership, direction, innovation within the sector that has been the hallmark of agriculture over the centuries. When we talk about leadership, how important it is for humanity, no one can deny that truth. So leadership is critical. It's very noisy. There's a lot of voices saying a lot of different things, and I can understand people getting confused. Regarding capabilities, mate, there is a whole list of capabilities that are really important. They all are interconnected. So the idea of teasing out 3 capabilities that are really important seems somewhat disingenuous. They all feed off each other, all right? But it is important that we focus in some of our attention to these 3 dimensions: foresight, strategic thinking, and decision making, because they have been the defining capabilities of human progress. I mean, at the end of the day, looking into the future, considering the future, it's not some esoteric or magic ball, glass ball. It's just we do it consciously and unconsciously. It's a central function of our brain. And it's interesting how, if you had to look at it organically, as an organization, as an organism, as a society, as an organism, as systems that interrelate, and then our brains, our families, our communities as systems, they should reflect what's been working for us, i.e. those contemplating the future, feeding off the past and our current situation, looking into what we should do, considering alternative choices, and then moving into a decision. Surely that should be the guiding principle for our leaders. The evidence shows that they're not following that. They're retreating from that, or they're leaving parts of it out. And that's the reason why we're focusing on it. Not because we don't agree that empathy, people skills, networks, financial skills, etc. aren't important. Of course they are. But this process is fundamental to everything we do. And if we don't get this right, doesn't matter how connected we are or how financially literate we are, we're not going to get progress happening.
And on that note, thank you, Luke, for your time. For those listening to the podcast, this has been Eric Perez speaking with Associate Professor Dr. Luke van der Laan of the University of Southern Queensland. Thank you for your time, Luke.
Pleasure, mate.
Once again, I'd like to thank Sydney Fish Markets for their support of this podcast, and thank you all for listening. I'll catch you all on the next podcast.